Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. All for our webinar, all about the biodiversity of the Detroit River. We are so excited to have you join us to learn more about the Detroit River from Jim Bull. My name is Sarah Halson, and I am the program coordinator for Detroit Audubon, an organization dedicated to fostering the appreciation and conservation of birds and the environment that we share. We could not do the work we do without our funders and our members, so I wanted to thank those of you who are members and supporting projects like these. Some quick Zoom housekeeping before we begin today. You're able to control your video and your microphone in the bottom left of your screen. We ask you keep yourself muted so that we don't receive feedback from your microphones. You can also see closed captioning today by clicking on the live transcript on the bottom of your screen. You can open the chat box by clicking on the chat button on the bottom of your screen. And we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please add any questions you might have to the chat. Jim did mention that this might go over an hour, so just to give you a heads up about that as well. We are also recording the webinar today, and it will be shared via email in the next week or so you can view it again or share it. If you have any further questions, please reach out to me, and I will do my best to assist you. And now I'd like to introduce Jim. Jim Bull is a 3-time past president of Detroit Audubon. He's the editor of the quarterly magazine, The Flyway. He's a field trip leader and the fund development and environmental policy coordinator. He teaches biology and environmental science at both Wayne County Community College and Macomb Community College. He holds a BS in biology and earth science from Adrian College, an MS in Fisheries and Wildlife from Michigan State University, and a Ph.D. in Natural Resources from the University of Michigan. Thank you so much and welcome, Jim.
Thank you, and so good to see so many of you here, and I see some familiar faces too, including from Wayne County Community College. This was a great opportunity to update this because I originally put this together after writing a chapter for a book about the Detroit River for the tricentennial of Detroit. And it was supposed to be ready for 2001, but it didn't get published till 2003. But it was a great opportunity to update it. So I'm excited to share this with you. And I think I'll just share my screen now. So I call this the biodiversity of the Detroit River Commons, past, present, and future prospects. And there's one word different from the chapter that I wrote with Julie Craves, and that is the word commons, because I first put this presentation together for a conference on rivers and water bodies that was held in Southfield. And the idea was, the theme of that conference was that rivers and water bodies are a commons that we share together. So that's why that word is there. It makes sense. So it's based on a chapter that I was the lead writer on for this, on biodiversity of the Detroit River in this book, Honoring Our Detroit River, Caring for Our Home, edited by John Hartig. I'd like to start out with some quotes, just kind of set a context for this. And the first one's from Aldo Leopold, who I think is just one of the seminal thinkers in conservation, who said, "We abuse land," and I include water there, and I know he included water too, but it's just a presentation about water, and I wanted to include that. "We abuse land and water because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land or water as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." And that goes back to 1949 in the San County Almanac. And then I also want to highlight what he called the land ethic, that we needed to expand our moral universe to include the land. And for him, the land includes soils and rocks, waters, plants, and animals. And this is the essence of the land ethic that he distilled, and that is, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, it is wrong when it tends otherwise. And you know something, I just realized I forgot to do something. I'm going to stop sharing and start again. Oh, it's there. I wanted to make sure I had the sound on. Okay. And then I wanted to share this quote, which I think distills the essence of ecology just better than about any other quote I've seen. And you may be surprised at who this quote comes from in that regard, but he, and it is a he said, it really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality. If there is a central or core principle or understanding in ecology, it's the interrelated structure of all reality. And I think the visionary that this person was, that he would, I think readily, if he were still with us, expand his vision beyond the necessary understanding of how people are interrelated to how people and the rest of the creatures and earth systems are interrelated as well. And we need to work in harmony with those as well. So who was it? Martin Luther King Jr. Right, rivers and lakes are land water systems. So you cannot protect the quality of a water body apart from protecting the quality of the land in its watershed. So what's a watershed? A watershed, if you find the highest points on either side of a water body, the land in between is its watershed. So, you know, the rain falling at the high point here, it flows downhill to this river, River A. And so does here. So this is the watershed of River A. And then over here would be the watershed of River B. There is also a term that is used a lot around the world that means the same thing, catchment basin. And if you were to plot those high points on either side of a water body on a map and then connect the dots, you get a map view. And here are the major watersheds in this region. We've got the Clinton River watershed here, the Rouge River watershed here, the Huron River watershed. This is where I live right here. I'm in Lincoln Park in the Ecorse Creek watershed. And then here is a little bit of the Raisin River watershed. All right, so now let's get into biodiversity. We need to define that, and there are lots of definitions, but this is, I think, the simplest and probably the best definition. You can get into a lot of nuance, get into detail, but I think this is the best general definition. It's a variety of life on Earth or any portion of the Earth. In biodiversity, the more biodiverse an area is, generally it's felt that is a good indication of its health. That more biodiverse, the healthier the ecosystem is. So you need to have ways to measure that. And the two basic ways that most ecologists use to measure this are species richness. And that's where you just count the number of species, not how many of each species are there, but just the number of species. So I think if you had a mosaic of made of colored tiles, you would be just counting the number of colors you had in that case. Now, I don't think that that's a particularly good measure. I really argue that what's more important, what we should be looking at, is native species richness. That only counts the species that are endemic or naturally occur in that area. It excludes exotics and invasives, which can skew the count and give you a false picture. And I will show you later in the slide program an instance of that. I do think species abundance is important as well. And this is where you do count the number you have of each species, because if you've got a very small number, it still counts as a species being there for even native species richness. But if the species is in very small numbers, it may be in trouble. It may be, on the way out. It may not be able to fulfill its role in the ecosystem. If there are too many, it may be causing problems in the ecosystem from overpopulation. And then another question is, what is the baseline? If we want to look at biodiversity of the Detroit River, then where are we going to start? And if we want to look at that with some concern about maybe restoring some of the river's biodiversity where it's been lost, then what do we restore it to? So we could go back 350 million years to the Devonian period when there was a shallow sea covering Michigan and we were located near the equator. And this is when the corals, were in this shallow sea, and one of them was Hexagonaria percarinate, which we know is a Petoskey stone, our state stone. And that's when those were formed, and they were formed by little tiny organisms, coral organisms or polyps that would have been in each of these holes here, and they would have secreted the limestone shell. Here again is a Petoskey stone, and then this is what the live coral might have looked like, and then the diagram showing a Hexagonaria with the little tentacles out. Or we might go back 11,000 years ago. And if we did, mastodons would have been the biggest and dominant animal around here, and it was very swampy. Jurassic Park notwithstanding, I don't think that that's really very much of a possibility to get back there either. What about going back, 1 to 2,000 years ago when the people here were Native American and they had a very low impact, almost negligible impact on the landscape, nomadic, and they're pretty much in harmony with the land. Now there are remnants we could get back to from this period, but we're not going to get back the vast forests and ecosystems we had then. But we can get some representative samples of that. What about the 16 to 1700s? This is when Europeans first started coming here. The French were the first, and they didn't have a great deal of impact on the landscape either, not much more than the Native Americans, with one exception. One of the reasons it didn't have a lot of impact is they weren't coming originally to settle here. They were coming for something else, and so they didn't need a lot of people for that. What they were coming for were furs, particularly furs of the beaver. It was in demand in the French fashion industry in Paris. This shows you the beaver, our largest rodent here. Generally live in lodges made of branches, and the entrance is usually underwater. They do have some bank lodges, and they have this big flat tail they can even use to slap as a warning. This is a canoe the voyageurs would have used to collect those furs, and they are really good at gnawing down trees. There's a beaver fur, and this is actually a fur trading cabin from Indiana Dunes where I used to work. It was historic. This is again the kind of canoes they would have used, and this is showing some evidence of beaver work. And then this is one that people confuse with the beaver. This is a muskrat, much smaller and has a thinner tail, and it likes cattails. It will make its smaller lodges out of cattails, not anything woody. And these are the kind of hats that the beaver was in demand for. You think of Paris fashion, you might have thought that, oh, that was for women's fashion. No, it was for men's fashion, for men's beaver felt hats. And by the way, to make these, you had to shear the fur off, and you had to mix it with glue, which included mercury, and that's where you got the Mad Hatter idea. because it sometimes would make the mercury poisoning would have effects on the brain. So these are some other hats. And here you can see a French priest with the fur traders and the famous Canaux du Nord, which were the really big ones for going out on the Great Lakes. And there are all kinds of songs that they would sing to keep their paddling in synchrony. Here's a fur trading post, much like would have been right here in Detroit. Trapper's Alley was named for that. Used to be a little mall there. Now it's the Greektown Casino site. And that's where there were several trading posts where Native Americans and also the fur traders went up into the hinterlands to bring their furs to trade for all kinds of goods. Then in 1701, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, and that's how you pronounce it in French. The double L is a Y sound, so it would have been Cadillac. He founded Detroit with Fort Pontchartrain right on the shore. And actually, it was a little bit later when he sent to Montreal for his wife and kids, and as did many of the others, and set up more of a town, which was named for the water body here, which is a Detroit. It's not Detroit in French, it's Detroit. And Cadillac wrote the Detroit is actually but a channel or river of medium breadth and 25 leagues in length, according to my estimate. So what's a Detroit? Detroit means strait or connecting channel in French. So the Detroit River is not a river in the normal sense. It's really a connecting channel, a strait. And the new settlement was La Ville de Detroit, or the city by the strait. So what two bodies of water do you think this Detroit connects? Lake St. Clair. If you said Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie, you're correct. This is Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie, and this is the Detroit. Right here, the Detroit River. And also, many of you probably know here, I have a trivial question with the Ambassador Bridge going between the US and Canada, you actually go south from Detroit to get to Windsor. So now we're going to look at some of the ecosystems that Cadillac found and see what they were like in 1701 from his writings, and then explore how they've changed, what they look like today, and what might be done to enhance their biodiversity for tomorrow, if that's called for or necessary. So prairies, grasslands. Cadillac wrote, the hand of the pitiless reaper has never mown the luxuriant grass upon which fatten the woolly buffaloes of magnificent size and proportion. I actually took this in Yellowstone, but actually there were bison here. I don't know if you thought of Detroit area as having large enough grasslands that there were bison. The last bison in Michigan was actually shot at Ojibwe Prairie in the 1890s near Telegraph and King Roads in Brownstown. There's a piece of that that's now saved, but not nearly enough of it in my mind. There's further evidence of extensive grasslands, and that there are two islands in the Detroit River, one on the US side and one on the Canadian side, that are both called Grassy Island. There's also an island the French called Île aux Dindes, and Dinde is French for turkey. It really means Turkey Island, named for the wild turkeys that were prevalent on that grassland on that island, particularly in oak savanna, lots of scattered oaks with grassland underneath them. And we're losing grasslands even faster than wetlands. There's no figures being kept on that. But we lose not only grasses and flowers, but we lose birds and insects and other animals that live in grasslands. And grasslands just don't have a very good reputation. People see long grass and flowers and they think, oh, that should be mowed. That's bad. That's not good. But one of Detroit Audubon's goals is to change that perception. So here are some of the birds that frequent grasslands that we're losing if we don't protect those grasslands. And so here's the eastern bluebird, and this is what it sounds like. It's a supposedly cheerful charmer, and then the eastern meadowlark, which is a blackbird, but it's got a brown back and a bright yellow breast and a black vest, and it seems to be saying, "Spring is here, spring is here." And there's a Hanzo Sparrow, and unfortunately this one's not working. I got to reestablish a connection to the audio here. The little tiny sparrow with kind of a flattish, almost greenish tinge to its head. Pretty rare. I know just a few places where they nest. One of them is Indian Springs Metro Park, right in the back of the tot lot. Indigo bunting, which is probably the most stunning blue you'll ever see, and it depends on the light. You know, it can be really iridescent. Kind of a jumble. Some people put the words fire, fire, where, there, no, here. An American goldfinch. Remaining prairies is a Ojibwe Prairie in Windsor, about 1,000 acres of prairie left there. Ojibwe Prairie in Brownstown, which part of it's sage, but there's more of it that needs to be. Indian Springs Metro Park, Eliza Howell Park in Detroit. And there's some prairie species hanging on in Belle Isle. Suzanne Campbell found native prairie plants there. And we're trying to get some of that restored there. And along railroad tracks, prairie plants will often survive. And if you are wanting to recreate a prairie with native prairie plants that were native to the region, good place to go is along railroad tracks because of the periodic fires that keep those prairie plants going. And speaking of periodic fires, that's how you have to manage a prairie usually. And here is a prescribed burn at Ojibwe Prairie. Native prairie plants are adapted to fire, and they need fire. You're not going to have shrubs and trees taking over. And also, if you don't want European weeds to take over. And why don't they take over? Well, the European weeds don't have the root system that the prairie plants have. Most of the biomass of prairie plants is underground. So if what's above ground burns, the roots survive and they come back pretty easily. And look at some of these. I mean, look how small this plant is here, and look how essential the root system is. These are definitely adapted to fire, and some of them can't even germinate unless the seeds are scarified by fire. Here is Ojibwe Prairie after a burn, and they've actually drawn in the trails to show where they are. And this is Ojibwe Prairie in May coming up, and it first starts to grow back, and then by July it's a riot of color, flowers. And here you see the herbaceous prairie, which is a substantial part. But then in the back, you see what's called an oak savanna, which is oaks that are widespread with prairie underneath them. And notice the people here. It's not really tall grass prairie here like on the Great Plains, but it's pretty tall. And they don't totally disappear, but they're kind of obscured with the tall grasses and flowers. This shows you the extent of Ojibwe Prairie. There are several parcels, but they're very close together, so they almost function as one. And it includes different jurisdictions, provincial park and city parks that have part of the prairie. There's a nature center there, and not very far from the Detroit River. In fact, the first time I saw a footprint for the new Gordie Howe Bridge, it was going to either go over this prairie or going to land in it. Luckily, they got that changed, so the prairie will be spared. Sibley Prairie is one of the largest and highest quality lake plain prairies in the Great Lakes region. It's been cited as a particularly special prairie by the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. It's in the Detroit River watershed. We have very little prairie left, and at least Detroit Audubon, Sierra Club, and other groups would like to see this prairie fully protected. It was slated for a housing development, and we testified against it, as did others. Now, a small part of it was saved by the Nature Conservancy, but it was mostly saved because the economy went south and they didn't wound up not having the money to go through with the housing development. And they kept saying, well, we're going to save the prairie. It's going to be a small part of it. But can you imagine, burning a prairie next to a housing development, or imagine cats from the housing development, getting into the prairie with all the ground nesting birds? It would have been devastating. Here is some of what you can see at Sibley Prairie, and we have had field trips there. We probably ought to have one again. Big blue stem grass, which is the same grass that you see in the tall grass prairies, sometimes called turkey foot. Tall coreopsis, monarch butterfly on a dense blazing star, bog laurel, because it is a lake plain prairie. It is not wet soil, so you get some plants in there that are both in prairies and in bogs. Swamp milkweed and purple coneflower, and there was a praying mantis there, and I particularly like this little girl that got acquainted with that praying mantis, and she just was intrigued. She just seemed to love it, and I think that's one of the big reasons to save prairies is to give children experiences like this of enjoyment and learning about the heritage of this this habitat and ecosystem that is disappearing. Very good prairies being destroyed on the east side of Detroit, and Detroit Audubon's doing some of that. We'll talk about Belle Isle, another place. Here's Eliza Howell Park, where there is extensive grassland. There's a small part that is devoted to prairie, but a much larger part could probably be turned into native grasses and wildflowers and become prairie. But there's already Savannah Sparrows nesting there, and wild turkeys and pheasants. Leonard Weber that's leading the tour here. You can see the prairie, and a little bit of it's like a savanna. And some of the oaks are exotic oaks, but they're pretty beautiful, almost like an arboretum. There's some of my students from Wayne County Community College at Eliza Howell Park. As I said, there are wild turkeys and pheasants here, and also down by Martin Luther King High School, downtown Detroit, at Milliken State Park. There have been pheasants at least there, and they've even stopped traffic in Windsor. Detroit Bird City is a project of Detroit Audubon to turn some of parks that have been underutilized into native grasslands with partnership with local communities. And here's the first one, Callahan Park. Here's trash that was picked up, and then the area being transformed. Rid of the turf grass, and then planting seed given to us by the U.S. Forest, Fish and Wildlife Service. And here's a dedication that was held before the planting happened. And this is what it looks like. In fact, it looked like that just within a couple months. Really beautiful. This is taken at a grassland next to Blue Heron Pond and on Belle Isle, which has been a great place for grassland birds. This was taken in either 2014 or 2015 of kids at a day camp that we helped with at the Nature Center on Belle Isle. Here's some of the birds that were found there. Savannah Sparrows, which are pretty rare around here. They got this yellow by their eye. And of course, the eastern meadowlark, field sparrows, eastern bluebird. All of these right near downtown Detroit. just amazing to have these grassland birds there. But in 2016, I do a birdathon where we raise money, people pledge money to Detroit Audubon for each bird species we see in a 24-hour period. And we go to different places, including Belle Isle. And we got to our grassland where we usually got the bluebirds and meadowlarks and so forth. And this is what we found, all mowed. Turned out the state park had leased this for 2 rock concerts that summer. We protested and they said, okay, we won't mow this anymore. And then the next thing we knew, just as it grew back and we thought, oh, maybe the birds will come back, there was a project to improve Lake Okanoka, which is just across the road. And where did they put the spoils when they dredged? All on this grassland. It looks like finally they may have grassland again this year, so hoping that some of these birds will be back, including the ones you just saw and the horned lark. And maybe we can reestablish a bluebird trail. There were bluebird boxes there and nesting bluebirds, but they were getting vandalized. Would love to have a bluebird trail out there. It should be trail, not try. Anyway, change that. But we're going to need help with that. We're going to need a cadre of folks to maintain that bluebird trail. And we're going to need permission from the DNR, but they look like they're amenable to putting it back in if there is a group willing to maintain it. And this shows, this is one in Wisconsin. This is with National Audubon and the young inside. And this was a snow bunting that we saw at that area where the grasslands come back this winter. They'll not be around in the summer. Wetlands. Cadillac said his borders are so many prairies, and prairies was a general term in French for habitats without any woody plants, no trees or shrubs. So when you're talking about the borders that are wet, he was talking about marshes. And so the freshness of the waters keep the banks always green. By the way, this was grassy. This is Grassy Island, no longer very grassy. This is the extent of wetlands on both sides. This border here was wetlands too. The wetlands came up to 1 mile to 2 miles inland from the river on both sides, Windsor side and the US side. On the US side, the wetlands at least came up to where Comerica Park is, and Grand Circus Park, which is next to it, was a wetland. So if you think about it, there's the river, the wetlands came clear up here to Comerica Park. At least a maze of them. In fact, in 1870, Silas Farmer, who wrote one of the first histories of Detroit, was writing about the making of Grand Circus Park and how it was so terrible before that it was just a swamp, and the only thing it was good for was for disposing of refuse, and the only sound you could hear, he said derisively, was the song of frogs. Well, I would love to hear the songs of frogs again. Hopefully we value wetlands more. And I think these are ones that don't work. I'm going to replace these. But I would love to hear frogs and toads. Detroit again, there is a place where you can hear them, but here's some of the wetland plants, arrowhead and duckweed, button bush. Named because people thought they looked like buttons, although I think only kind of button I've ever seen like that might have been on a clown suit. The green heron, they usually are in the water, but here's one actually on a perch. Looking from on high to see if you can find a fish or she. And woodcocks, which we actually get a lot of those coming in migration to downtown Detroit. And unfortunately, a lot of them are hitting windows and dying. But they also are prevalent in wet fields near woods. And they're a shorebird that really likes a little more of an upland, but still has to be kind of wet or moist. And they have, I think this is the bird I think of as the harbinger of spring, not the robin, because robin, some of those stay around all winter. They've got a flexible beak and they only feed on worms and bugs in the wet, mucky soil. And so they got to have thawed land and soil to dig into and to probe into. And actually, they actually have nerves in their beaks. They can actually open the end of their beak to clasp onto a insect or a worm. And they got their eyes way in the back of their head, so they can actually see better behind them than in front of them. But if you got your nose down in the soil, probably better to look behind you for a predator than in front of you. See if these work. This is what they sound like when they're doing their courtship on the ground. And this buzzing, buzz, and they do kind of a dance on the ground. But then they'll fly at an angle, and then they just will spiral up so you can't even see them. Then they do a dance in the sky coming down, and I don't think these are going to work. They kind of go zip, 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 and they'll come right back down near where they started. And if a female is impressed, then he mates with her, and then she goes and makes the nest and lays her eggs, and he'll keep displaying, for another 3 or 4 weeks for other females. Elizabeth Park in Trenton is a Wayne County park. It was known as Slocum's Island, and still the road going into it is called Slocum Road. He gave it to Wayne County with 2 conditions. It was to be named Elizabeth Park in honor of his daughter, and the wetlands around it were to be dredged so it would be a true island. That latter one was unfortunate. It would be a good place to maybe restore some wetlands. There are lots of ducks that use this, but we've lost the wetlands here. Some of the wetlands have been restored on the Detroit River on one side of the park, but not in the canal. But the canal, as I said, is home to lots of ducks in the winter. A lot of the shoreline of the Detroit River has been hardened with stone or steel break walls, so there are not a lot of wetlands left. In fact, we've lost 97% of the wetlands on the Detroit River. But there are some places where instead of using rocks, like on Hennepin Point in Grosse Ile, the Grosse Ile Nature and Land Conservancy is taking a softer approach, or a green shoreline approach, using plants rather than a hardened shore. And this is good for fish and all the other wildlife that inhabit the shore or near shore. We've got some exotics that are problems: Phragmites, common reed, which is a salt-loving plant that came from overseas, I think from Australia, and also purple loosestrife. Purple loosestrife, there's a little beetle that even some high school biology classes are raising, like Carlson High School in Gibraltar raises them. I know that loose in Lake Erie Metro Park. And so Phragmites has been gotten under control. I mean, it's beautiful, but it just takes over if you don't control it from the native vegetation. Phragmites, there's no insect I know of that eats this. It's got very hard stems, so you have to burn it, and use pesticides and lots of applications to do this. But they've been successful at Lake Erie Metro Park and at Lake St. Clair Metro Park with control of Phragmites finally. And they're working on it on Belle Isle too. So again, the Detroit River environments have lost 97% of their original wetlands. Remaining wetlands are on Belle Isle, which is almost all swamp and marsh. And getting rid of Phragmites is one of the big things needed there. Hennepin Marsh, north end of Grosse Ile. Humbug Marsh, which is part of the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge. The Canard River Marsh in Canada, which I tried finding it once. I got to get some Canadians to show me where it is, because I have not been able to find it. But I understand that's a significant marsh on the Canadian side. And Fighting Island, which is also in Canada, it's owned by BASF, and they have restored that to it's like a nature sanctuary. Where could we restore more wetlands? On Belle Isle and some of the low areas, Grosse Ile on the southern end is already being done. Elizabeth Park on that canal, Humbug Marsh, and there actually doing that there. They've got a wetland that was made from daylighting a stream that was underground right by the new visitor center. And a sample wetland was put in at William Milliken State Park. Most of Detroit was filled in and is much higher than the river. It never didn't used to be that way. So they actually had to pump water into the marsh at Milliken State Park. By the way, Peter Stroh was one of the inspirations for the River Walk, very much a nature enthusiast. So here's the marsh at Milliken State Park. You have to pump water into it. It has a beautiful interpretive sign, but it's such a small wetland. The red-winged blackbirds nesting there. You know, you walk on either side of the wetland on one of these walkways, you're too close to their nest, and they actually will come at you and knock your hat off. But hopefully we can just endure that for a few weeks. And you can see it fills in with vegetation, but here you can see the margins of it. And they, as I say, they do have to pump water in here from the Detroit River. Here's a marsh wren, and there actually were 3 of them. They're very secretive that were nesting the first year. I haven't seen whether they've nested the last couple years or not, but pretty amazing. I had a friend, a birder, that was up for the Kirtland's Warbler census north, and we came back to Detroit, and I showed her this park, and we heard marsh wrens, and she just was astounded. She said their friends in Massachusetts didn't think believe that there were marsh wrens right in downtown Detroit. And also red-winged blackbirds, as I said, they can, the males get, so they don't want you messing with their young, so they might even try to get you out of there. But their sound is spring and summer to me in the marsh. And they really, those red apollets to tell other red-winged males this is their territory and you better get out of here. This is the female, doesn't look anything like the male. Almost like a sparrow. The sunset over the wetland at Milliken Park. This is a low area where a wetland maybe could be restored if there was interest at Belle Isle. Woodlands. It said there are 10 species of forest trees. Among them are the walnut, the white oak, the ash, the pine, the whitewood, and cotton with straight as arrows without knots and of prodigious size. Whitewood, we're not sure what that is, but I'll show you some pictures of what it might have been. Some of the islands were named for their trees. Sugar Island was named for the sugar maple trees on it. Sugar Island's just south of Grosse Ile. It's now part of the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge, and it's known for its beech maple forest. Here's the American beech trees, which are part of the beech maple forest. Also a nice beech maple forest at the downriver campus of Wayne County Community College. Unfortunately, people like to carve into the soft wood of the beech tree, which I think is unfortunate. You have papery leaves that are very symmetrical, very beautiful. Hickory Island is named for its oak hickory forest. It's at the south end of Grosse Ile as well. And here's shagbark hickory. You can see why it's named that. And here are the hickory nuts and the compound leaves. There are also some other less common hickories. You can find shellbark and shoemarg, bitternut, and pignut hickory. Red oaks that have the pointed lobes and kind of light and dark streaking on the trunks. White oak with the smooth scallop lobes of their leaves and kind of a light grayish bark. The alba means white. I don't ever look white to me. It's kind of look lighter gray. This is swamp white oak. It still has scallops, but not as deep. And kind of like the bur oak, has a little bit of burning on it. And there's northern pin oak. It has very deep sinuses on the leaves, and then it's got branches that come down. I got it. Is my favorite pin oak is on Belle Isle. It's a huge one. Pin oaks are mostly understory trees, but there's a huge one on Belle Isle, and they've got these kind of weeping branches. It's characteristic. Chinkapin oak. It's one of the oaks that's There's some swampy conditions, and bur oak is one of the oaks for the oak savannas that will be widespread with prairies underneath them. And you can see why they got their name. And these are all part of the white oak group. So where did that white wood come from? Well, it could have been from paper birch, which is used to make native canoes. But if that's the case, the climate has changed a lot, and their natural distribution is way north here in northern Michigan. But it could also have been big-tooth aspen, which has a light bark, a little more of a green tinge to it, but that might have been it. Bois Blanc got corrupted. We know Bois Blanc Island now as Boblo Island, which was known for an amusement park when I was a kid. Now in exclusive housing development, some of the animals of the forest include the eastern fox squirrel, which used to be the exclusive squirrel here. The eastern gray was further north, but now they're both here. And by the way, these are both gray squirrels. This is just a black morph. It's one species. And we're in the eastern deciduous forest, which means the leaves turn color in the fall and then the trees lose their leaves. There's a deer on the edge of the forest. They'll bed down in the forest, but they like to use the fields for feeding. And there are two major types of deciduous forest. We have beech maple forest and oak hickory, which you've already mentioned. This is on the leaves turn of a sumac, which is a shrub that grows on the edge of the forest, like on the roadsides. And they have berries that make a wonderful substitute for lemonade. And we also have Carolinian Forest. This is pretty amazing. It's way north of where it should be, but named for where it's most predominant in the Carolinas. But it can be found in Lower Huron Metro Park, remnants, Sterling Heights Nature Center, the Downriver campus of Wayne County Community College is a nice sampling of Carolinian forest trees. And Canada's Petch Island, which is just north of Belle Isle. And some of the trees are the Kentucky coffee tree with this brown pod with seeds. One of my favorites is the hackberry. It looks like somebody took clay and made ridges stuck on the tree. And these berries that taste like dates, if you can reach them. Pawpaws that look almost tropical with these huge leaves. There's lots of pawpaws at Wayne County Community College downriver campus. It's hard to find fruits on them though. They've tried to raise them commercially and it hasn't worked because they're not consistent fruiters. But it's a tasty fruit. Here's an oak savanna. Widespread oaks with prairie underneath. The Native Americans didn't have, as I said, much of an impact on the flora and fauna of the forest. And they probably didn't have a little more success when they traded furs for rifles. But even so, they still were pretty much living in harmony with the animals and plants. But that wasn't so true for Europeans. And the passenger pigeon, which some of the Native Americans said was God's favorite bird, most beautiful bird, they thought. And there were just billions of them. In fact, they were so many, they would darken the skies for days. Sometimes, a million more birds would go by in one flock. And they'd fill up just whole groves of trees. But they were just caught mercilessly for food on squab. They were sent to Chicago and New York City. And by the way, one of the ways they catch them, I ought to get a picture of this, is by using, they catch one of them and they tether it to a post, and then they have a trap that could collapse on them. And they're very gregarious, and they put some seed down there, and the captured passenger pigeon, that would attract more passenger pigeons, and then they close the trap and they'd have a whole bunch of passenger pigeons. What was that pigeon called that was the bait? Stool pigeon. The last passenger pigeon died in Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. People thought, oh, there's no way we could have any impact on them. There's just so many of them, but they needed huge populations to maintain their our courtship and so forth. It just didn't work. Well, the closest thing we have now is the European rock dove, or rock pigeon, which is known in cities. Not quite the same. And then the beautiful mourning dove, which we can see at our feeders, which is native. And other birds that frequent our parts of the northern cardinal, which used to be southern, and now is even up in the northern lower peninsula, and have come north. The red-bellied woodpecker, which is also increased in population, used to be a little more southern as well. This is a female with a gray on top. The male would have red all the way and a white-breasted nuthatch. Now, some things we don't see anymore in Detroit that used to be seen in the early days are black bears and moose. Now, black bears, they can be found, further down to the Smoky Mountains. There just isn't enough wildland for them here, so I don't think we're ever going to bring back black bear. Moose, there's not only not enough wildland, but the climate, I think, has changed, and you're not going to find those till you get to the UP now. There also were bobcats, Canada lynx, and gray wolves. And of course, there's just not enough wildland for them here anymore either. You can find wolves in the UP now. They have come back. We've lost 78% of our forests in southeast Michigan, but the woods are still beneficial for migration stopovers for a lot of species. We're at the convergence of two flyways, the Mississippi and the Atlantic. So we get lots of good birds, and Belle Isle is a great place for that. I saw this first Kirtland's warbler was in Michigan City, Indiana, and I used to put this in here saying, well, this is the kind of bird that you might get in Detroit. I haven't seen it yet, but it's a possibility. Lo and behold, 2017, one was found on Belle Isle. And I was on Belle Isle that day doing a birdathon, but I was there about an hour and a half before the person who found it. And there was a very heavy rainstorm, and we sought shelter and got some coffee and like a donut, and then headed on to another site. We should have gone back to Belle Isle. But some great pictures of a Kirtland's warbler on Belle Isle, and there have probably been a lot more of them stopped by that just haven't been seen. Some other birds, lots of other warblers, including the black-throated green warbler and Lincoln sparrow, you've been seen in migration. Where our forest left, a lot of our metro parks, Rouge Park, Belle Isle, and Humbug Marsh. And these need to be preserved, but there are some areas where there are a lot of exotics come in that probably ought to be removed. One of them is Tree of Heaven, which is an exotic from China. They really like disturbed places. We had one in our backyard growing up. Dad had it cut down, and I think when we got it cut down, I figured that the reason they call it Tree of Heaven, because it stinks to high heaven. When you cut it, it just smells. A really foul smell. Black locust, which is a beautiful tree, but it really is a southern tree and doesn't belong here. So probably should be taken out of our native woodlands. One place I wouldn't take it out of is Lafayette Park. Mies van der Rohe, the architect, loved black locusts, and he just has black locusts all over here and created almost a forest of them. And I don't think they're any threat to a nearby forest. And they have created quite a beautiful habitat for birds there. And you can see from the air just how great it would look for birds. Looking from the air, they'd stop here. And there are even Cooper's hawk nesting right next to the condo of one of my friends from church, who was a birder. Since moved to Colorado. We used to have white ash, green ash, and red ash, and pumpkin ash. These ashes have compound leaves, beautiful, beautiful trees. But then the emerald ash borer came in here, and they're mostly all dead. Hopefully we can maybe bring them back, but it's sad. My parents talked about chestnut trees that they lost during their lifetime before they got married. And then I remember the elm trees lining streets that we lost, and now we've lost the ashes. Aquatic environment. Cadillac said, the fish are nourished and bathed by the living waters of crystal clearness, and their great abundance renders them none the less delicious. Swans are so numerous that one would take for lilies the reeds in which they crowded together. The gabbling goose, the duck, and the bustard, I think it may be a heron, are so abundant that to give an idea of their numbers, I must use the expression and I'm going to say Native American. He didn't use that term. It was more pejorative, so I won't use that. This woman asked before arriving if there was much game. So much, he said, that they'd draw off in line to let the boats pass. In other words, it was hard for the boats to get through. There were so many. Why did they come here? Well, it has a lot to do with the food. Water celery or eelgrass. It grows in the water. Canvasbacks. There's so many canvasbacks here in the winter. I never thought that there was an issue with them, but I guess they're in trouble when you look at their North American total population. But we have about a quarter of the population winters here. This is the sunny south for them. They nest further north and they winter here. You have this sloping beak, both the male and female, but the male has this reddish head and a white back that I guess look like canvas to paint on, I guess. That's why they're called canvasbacks. This is the female, the brown head. And here is just this big rafts of them, just thousands. There's also a redhead here. There's a black, has a gray back. This is how they count them. They take aerial photos. And there are, every year, 200 to 300,000 that winter here on Lake St. Clair on the Detroit River. A beautiful bird that has come to be prominent here is the mute swan. It's an exotic from Europe, very beautiful. This one I just took with this beads of water off of Dingle Park in Ecorse. This is and they're doing some control of mute swans because they will drive out native species like black terns and others. So there can be real problems. As beautiful as they are, this is the tundra swan, named because they nest up on the tundra. It used to be called the whistling swan. And they like the duckweed along with the ducks, which is a small, not algae, it's a small flowering plant. See a little tiny flower there. And you can see tundra swans by the thousands at Lake Erie Metro Park, which is really mostly on the Detroit River. And we even have pelicans. Pelicans have been migrating through for a long time. But my friend Bruce Shahowski found evidence of nesting in 2019. See the young one here? In fact, he took this picture, and these were way in the distance, and he blew it up when he got home to take a look at it, and he said, oh, there's a young one there. And he wound up being the first to document white pelicans nesting in Michigan and coming through in migration on their way further north and west. But there they are here. This was an eared grebe that visited just this winter at Bishop Park in Wyandotte. I took pictures of. And a red-breasted merganser is in flight over Point Mouillet, which is near where the Detroit River empties into Lake Erie. A snow goose flying with the skyline of Detroit behind it from Belle Isle in one of our winter field trips this year. There's the snow goose again, and then feeding along with Canada geese on the ground. A Canada goose, and then, which, by the way, in the 1940s, they were afraid they were going to go extinct. Wouldn't think that now, but they've come back in a big way. Here is a trumpeter swan, which actually nest in northern Michigan and also west. I've got to have a friend on a condo complex in Ann Arbor, and they say they have trumpeter swan pair that nest in their pond there. Cackling geese, another special goose. It's a lot smaller, has a shorter beak than the normal Canada goose. They're more the size of a mallard duck. By the way, that's a common Canada goose, and that in behind is the cackler. is on Belle Isle and also Elizabeth Park. You know, Eurasian water milfoil is an exotic that's coming with ballast water. Now how the ships will take in water in a foreign port to give them enough weight and balance them out. But when they come across and get into the Great Lakes, they need to fill those holds up with cargo. And so they just open their holds and let the water out. And we've got, you know, lots of exotics. In fact, some say that the Great Lakes are the world's biggest aquarium, you know, for exotic fish and plants and other organisms. That's unfortunate. And actually, there was a rule against this. You had to treat and kill anything that was in the water before letting the water out. And that was about 4 years ago. And before the rule could get in place, the last president's administration nixed it. So we'll see if it was reinstated or not. Aquatic invertebrates. Cadillac did not have any quotes about them, but he does talk about the fish. And the fish were so abundant, these had to be abundant. Here are some of the names of Mayfly Nymph with 7 pairs of gills and 3 tails. And these are other species. You see the gills, the 7 pairs of gills. This is what the adult looks like. Around here, a lot of times they're called fish flies. And they're the ones that trout fishermen will tie flies to look like, you know, the ones that are emerging to try to fool them. They only live for about a day, maybe 2. And the only thing they don't feed, they just have sex and lay eggs. And in fact, amazingly enough, even though they live only 1 or 2 days, they actually molt once to get their wings and they molt again. The only group of insects that molts after it gets its first pair of wings. And then after a day or 2, they die in huge numbers and they wind up smelling like rotten fish as they decompose, which is why they get that name, fish fly. I didn't have time to get in here, but I have a picture from from Lake Sinclair Metro Park, where we were before the Black Tern cruise. I went to the nature center with the naturalist to greet people there, and we were going to bus them over to the boat. She couldn't get in the back door as it was like 3 feet high with just dead mayflies. Zebra and quagga mussels. The zebra mussel came in 1986, the quagga in 1991, and now I guess the quagga is the biggest problem now. There was a mussel survey done in 1982-83. 97% of them were native. 1992 to 94, only 10% of them were native. So that's a really huge problem. They've also made the lake and rivers a lot clearer, and they really filter out a lot of the toxins, though. And it turns out that one of the ducks that we get here in the winter, the scaup, they like to feed on zebra mussels, and their population just soared when the zebra mussels first came in, and then it just really went down significantly. We don't know for sure why, but we know on the East Coast it was documented that it was toxins in the zebra mussels that was the problem. This is a spiny water flea that is a really bigger problem because of this long spine here that will get caught in a fish's throat and sometimes prevent them from eating again. They'll just starve to death. After the fur trade, fishing was the big industry. Whitefish and lake trout were sent by thousands of barrels to New York City and Chicago and other places from here. Why are they gone? Well, overfishing, but also sea lamprey parasitism, and then, of course, pollution. Now, remember I told you about native species richness? Here's why I think native species richness is important. This is species richness. There was a fish survey done in 1952 on the Detroit River. They found 47 species. 1982, they found 46 species. Now, this doesn't look bad. It's like, wow, that's probably a pretty healthy ecosystem. It doesn't tell the whole story because there were 16 species found in 1952 that were were extirpated by 1982, totally gone. And 15 exotic species came in, like alewife, smelt, and sea lamprey. So if we use native species, for instance, this would have been the figures. 47 species native in 1952, 1982, 31. Now this would make you sit up and take notice. Something is not right here. Whereas seeing 46 over here, the line kind of lull you into complacency. There's a sea lamprey. It's a parasitic fish. It's ocean going. They do spawn in small streams upstream, but they live in the ocean, and they got into the Great Lakes when we built a canal around Niagara Falls to allow for shipping. They do try to control sea lampreys. If you want to see live ones, I do have some at the Belle Isle Aquarium. Another exotic was smelt. They've gone down in numbers, but you get those by wading out in the water and just dipping in your net and getting lots of them. And they're very tasty. Our neighbors used to go smelt fishing, and they give us 2 great big bags of them, but you don't see that much anymore. Gizzard shad. You see dead fish along the river or Lake Erie, and particularly this time of year, and getting into later in the spring, it might be gizzard shad. And people think, oh, it must be really polluted. Well, it could be, but another thing is that these fish are ocean-going fish, and they are not used to the sudden changes in temperature, and that will get them. And you can have lots of dead fish just from that. Alewives. It's one of the reasons that salmon were brought in addition to sport fishing, to control the alewives, which had taken over from the native prey fish. But the Detroit River has really come back. It has been cleaned up tremendously. I mean, it's not that we're finished with the job, but it is cleaned up enough that you can have some good fishing here. And Trenton calls itself the walleye capital of the world. There's a tournament they host, international tournament, where if you catch the tagged walleye, there's a little $16,000 prize. And here's father and son with some walleye off of gross eel. Carp. To understand, were actually intentionally introduced to the Detroit River. One of the few fish that survived and survived well during the polluted times, because they can come up and breathe oxygen from the air. They don't have to get it from their gills, and very tolerant of pollution. They also mess it up for other fish rooting in the bottom. But you don't want to eat carp from the Detroit River, and even the native catfish you don't want to eat from the Detroit River, as they're getting into the bottom sediments, and there's still some bottom sediment areas that are toxic hotspots, are filled with toxins. Round goby, another fish that came in with ballast water, that's competing with native prey fish and small fish. And some good news is the lake sturgeon has come back. There are lake sturgeon that are now spawning off of Fighting Island. They've tried to put in some artificial spawning reefs off of Belle Isle, but they haven't used them so far. But it's good news that they're spawning off of Fighting Island. These were around at the time of the dinosaurs, so these are really ancient fish. And they're also the fish that has been in demand other places for caviar. Hawks. We have got hawk migration that's incredible here. It really is the best place in North America, even though we're not as well known as Hawk Mountain. The broad-wing hawk migration is tremendous. Very broad wings and dark and light striped tail. Look at the numbers here. Some of the hawks and eagles, and this is from 1990 to 1999. It's really, the eagles have gone way up from there. Here are some of them. The turkey vultures go by in huge numbers, and the red-tailed hawks, and they are counted at Lake Erie Metro Park. There's a hired counter and then volunteers that work with them to count the hawks every year. You are not seeing this rock. There were 555,371 broadwing hawks on one day, September 19th, 1999, in Lake Erie Metro Park. Just amazing. You can see they're kettling, they will spiral and they'll ride the thermals, the hot air that takes them up, so they don't have to fly as much. Eagles, according to Cadillac, said, "Here the courageous eagle that fixedly at the sun was sufficient at his feet to satisfy his boldly armed claws." This is a picture Bruce Yahowski took of a bald eagle this winter at Elizabeth Park, County Park in Trenton. The perch dinner. Bald eagles can be found on the ice on the Detroit River. I've counted as many as 11 on a trip to Belle Isle when there's good ice around the island. And sometimes you may not recognize them because the first couple years they don't have the white. So the bald eagle disappeared from the Detroit River over 50 years ago to the DDT, causing eggshells to thin. Their eggshells would crack when they started to incubate them, but now they're nesting on the wildlife refuge, they're nesting at Point Mouillet, and they're nesting on Belle Isle. And they're wintering on Mud Island a lot. I've seen as many as 30 on the island at one time. Here you can see a bunch of them in the winter. On Mud Island, which is right off of Ecorse at Dingle Park. Here again is Dingle Park. This is a nesting eagle at Humbug Marsh in the refuge, artificial platform. And this is one that's been for 3 years now, I think, on Belle Isle at 4. In fact, 2 years ago, they had 3 young, which is unheard of. 2019, yeah, 3 years ago. Which is pretty amazing. Osprey came back last year and were nesting. They were talking about putting a platform up for osprey on Belle Isle, and they beat us to it, and they nested a couple of them on lights at the athletic field. And I've seen them up north nesting on lights at a ball field as well. Interesting. Here are platforms that could be put up for them in some areas. And these are the Belle Isle osprey. I know Diane Chuckage, who took this, was really sick about this picture because it had this plastic in it. And showing, they're picking up for us. And probably a sign that we weren't doing too well at picking up for ourselves. Well, it's great to see them. I remember seeing them feeding at Humbug years ago before we launched the campaign to save Humbug. But it's great that they're nesting again. And by the way, now that eagles and osprey are both back, you might see some interaction between them because eagles, they're opportunists. They sometimes will steal fish from osprey. And here's a video that shows that. Maybe, right there. The osprey just caught a fish. The eagle sees it. We actually watched a similar interaction to this on Belle Isle, actually. There it dropped the fish. And a lot of times they'll go around and catch that fish again. There's an osprey catching a fish. It's spectacular. Peregrine Falcons that never used to be in Detroit. They nested on cliffs up in the Upper Peninsula. But this is a new one that's come here, and they've been on the endangered species list. So it's great that they now see buildings like cliffs. They were going to be, they thought about releasing them here, but they came on their own. This is the Whittier across from Belle Isle. We sometimes see them on the Whittier on the Belle Isle trip. This is one that nests on the Ambassador Bridge. It's on the Canadian side, so not visible from the US side, but a pretty good place to raise young. Here are buildings where office workers, get to watch peregrines. There's a nest up here, and here's one just roosting. Common terns nest on rocky beaches and peninsulas and are no longer common. They nest on rocky beaches and shorelines, and their nest is not much anything. They just put the eggs and just a little bit of a scrape they make in the ground. I started banding common terns when I was 7. On Boblo Island, there were 2,000 nests on that island, and there were at least 500, if not 1,000 nests on Belle Isle as well. And we banded there with my dad's friend, Walter Nickel from Cranbrook. There probably were at least 4,000, if not many more, on the Detroit River. But one of the things that happened was the place on Belle Isle where they were nesting was near the water treatment plant, and apparently the superintendent had the workers go through and destroy nesting and mow them down, the eggs and the chicks. And they wound up leaving. There was a big fight, and finally the city council said that the terns could stay, but they never came back until recently. So habitat's been created, but it needs to be bigger. This originally was one area I thought we could bring back habitat, but it actually is back in the original area by the water treatment plant. But I think there've only been 14 here. They need to have, it used to be about a half-mile long, this peninsula with gravel. And we found, at least in my research, that terns colonies are not very successful unless they number at least 300 to 500 at least, because then they have the numbers to fight off predators. This is Mud Island, that same island where the eagles were. This is in the 70s. It was all, we were the tallest things on that island. This was our whole thing was a common tern colony. The refuge talked about bringing part of it back for terns, but it just would be too hard. It's too wooded. The other thing that's happened is ring-billed gulls, which used to be really small in number, they've really taken off because of trash and garbage, and they're taking over sites from terns. Ring on the bill. This is Walter Nickel, who was one of the early presidents of Detroit Audubon and who I used to band terns with, banding little chick. This is where they have been nesting. This is on the protection pier on Grosse Ile, about 150 to 170 on both sides of the bridge. And I was helping my friend Bruce Shahowski band. That's what they look like when they hatch. And pretty soon they dry off like this. And their eyes are open right away. This is putting a color band on one. My friend Bruce banding it. This is me banding one in Saginaw Bay. Only one nest had a chick in this whole island colony. This is me with a fledgling. It was on the front page of the News Herald, my friend Bruce's project, and they had me on the front page. This is, he put tiled numbers down by them so they had their own addresses even. No, I don't think the Postal Service delivered there. This is one of, it's getting very near to being able to fly as a fledgling. So there's the common tern, very beautiful bird with a swallow-like tail, and that's what its scientific name refers to. It's showing night because we were banding the birds here, and then we come back and the chicks would all be gone. So we started staying there at night, seeing what was happening. Turns out black-crowned night herons were coming in, young ones that had, pretty much just fledged, and they were just feasting on the young. So we were going out with volunteers every night and putting baskets that I got at a dollar store over them and with rocks to protect them from predators. And then the refuge took over, and they were doing predator control, and they also put up fencing, but it wasn't working very well. And they finally decided that just it's too predator prone, and we really need to create habitat elsewhere. And then the coup de grace was it's now been flooded. There's just no place for them to nest anymore. So Detroit River biodiversity designations, it's been called a biodiversity investment area by the U.S. Canadian State of the Lakes Conference. It has one of the highest biodiversities of fish and wildlife in all of Michigan. 65 species of fish now, 300 species of birds, and that was from our records. 150 of them are nesting, 29 are waterfowl. It's designated an American Heritage River by President Clinton, and the first international wildlife refuge in the world is on the river. It's international river, and also it has been designated in 2017 as a Detroit Urban Bird Treaty City. And here's that signing ceremony. I was president of Detroit Audubon at the time, so I was signing along with the sustainability director for Detroit, the city, the head of life sciences at the Detroit Zoo, and the director of the DNR, and so forth, and some students who were there to witness it. So it's a great birding place, great for wildlife. Detroit may be Motor City, but it's Bird City as well, and Wildlife City. And we need to get that story out there, and we need to conserve what we have and enhance what we have as well. These are cliff swallow nest on the bridge to Belle Isle from Gabriel Richard Park, unique pottery nest. And here's a dedication where I was president, and we dedicated a joint project with the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy to and the river and the refuge to put in a interpretive display and some spotting scopes at Gabriel Richard Park to explain the importance of the river to birds. And here are some kids getting the first time to use the spotting scopes. And one of the neat places on the river is the Detroit River National Wildlife Refuge. Starting in 2001, I remember going to a meeting with a whole bunch of people in Windsor to create a vision for the river. And Peter Stroh and John Dingle came in late. They listened to our presentations, the groups reporting back, and then they gave us their idea of starting the International Wildlife Refuge. And, oh, well, that's great, but how could that ever happen? Within 2 years, it was reality. Here's Humbug Marsh, was slated for a major housing development. All the trees in Oak Savannah, 400-year-old trees were going to be cut. Here's Humbug Island and Humbug, and this is where the new Refuge Visitor Center is. This is where the new marsh is. It's been put in, and a new fishing pier out here. So there's the island. This is the site where the new visitor center has gone in. And you can get lost in a canoe in here and you think you were in northern Michigan, even though there's industry very nearby. And most of the marsh is, by the way, is submergent or floating. There's only a small part of it that's actually emergent. Egret being chased by a red-winged blackbird that I will take. Egret, which is a symbol of National Audubon. It's an osprey. I first saw it, Humbug, and they're now back nesting. Eagles are back nesting. Great blue herons I saw in huge numbers in migration, 150 of them I think I counted. And actually about that number of the egrets too. Blue-winged teal, sounding by in migration, yellow legs. Also smallmouth salamanders and endangered pug-nosed minnow. Frequent this area, great horned owls. And these are the huge 300 to 400-year-old trees in that oak savanna at Humbug, and which is just a mecca for a bird that's not easy to see elsewhere, but there's just lots of them, the brown creeper. So that's part of the refuge. It's the gem of the refuge now. This is a shelter built by Lincoln Park High School, my alma mater, and CB's for use by educational groups where they can store educational equipment. Before the visitor center was built, this is the visitor center. It is not opened yet because of COVID, but hopefully will open yet this year. Now here's the fishing pier, which is amazing, and there's also off to the side is a dock for the school ship It takes kids out for educational experiences, school kids. And it is the John Dingell Visitor Center after Congressman John Dingell, who had the idea for the refuge in the first place. And there's the refuge. And, you know, beaver is what brought people here to the Detroit River in the first place. And they were extirpated. And I often said when I first gave this show that if beaver ever came back to the Detroit River, that would be a great sign. They'd come back to the Cuyahoga River, which once burned. That was in 1980. But you know, the story continued. These are evidence of beaver at Oakwoods Metro Park. And this is evidence of beaver on Belle Isle. They've cut down some of the willows on Belle Isle. They're back on the Detroit River and the Detroit area big time. These pictures were taken by my friend Bruce Shahowski just, I think, a week and a half, 2 weeks ago at Point Mouillet. And definitely a beaver, not a muskrat. So that's Detroit River biodiversity.
Thank you so much, Jim. That's wonderful. We do have a few questions. The first one was, with the beavers return to Belle Isle and nearby, when do you think we might have river otters return to the Detroit River or Southeast Michigan?
Wow, that would, I could see them coming to Point Mouillet maybe. I have my doubts they would be on Belle Isle. Otters usually like faster water. You know, they, you know, a faster, you know, stream. But that would be really cool. I've only seen them a few times in my life in the wild.
That would be cool. Also, Julie asks, in working to bring back biodiversity along the river, do you expect cooperation or not from the city of Detroit?
Yeah, we've had good cooperation. In fact, the planning department just has some really visionary people. In fact, remember the first time I met a Detroit planning department person, they actually came, I think, from Chicago, and we got to talking, and he said, you think Detroit Audubon would support diversifying habitat on the Detroit River and having more vertical habitat, you know, so we don't just have trees and, you know, just grass underneath, but have, you know, understory and so forth. And I said, we've been looking for somebody to talk to about that. So I think we're going to see more of that.
Fantastic.
And we're working with them on Detroit, the Detroit Bird City, in creating grasslands. But I think we can, in fact, we've been giving input on the new park on the west side of the river, and, you know, the, what is called, over by the post office. And that's one of the comments we made, was wanting to have at least part of it where there would be trees and some understory and shrubs. So it could be a stopover for migratory birds at least.
Yes, definitely. All right, and the last question we have is the International Wildlife Refuge land open to visitors right now? Where is the best place to park? And thank you. This is a great
Well, there are different units. There is a unit on the southern end of Grosse Ile called the Gibraltar Bay unit. That's open every day. You might be open, I think it's open all the time now. The small parking lot there. And then Humbug Marsh is now open. I believe it's Monday through Friday. I don't think it, no, maybe it's Wednesday through Sunday. It's open on the weekends. Anyway, you can park at the visitor center. The visitor center is not open, but the pier is open and the trails of Humbug are now open. You can go on their website to find the exact hours, but I've gone by there a lot of times, even when I haven't gone in, and it seems like it's always open when I've gone by.
Great. And wonderful. So that is it for today. Thank you so much, Jim.
So I think the Detroit River is something to celebrate. It's a comeback river for a comeback city. And I think that people, I think too much have the impression that it's a polluted cesspool, and it's not. It's a pretty clean river, and it's just a wildlife mecca, and we need to tell that story and enjoy it
Indeed.
on some of the field trips, right, Sarah?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yes, thank you again, everyone, for coming today. And
Thank you.
you can find out the next webinars that we have coming up and our field trips from the Flyway Express or our website or on Facebook. Oh, we do have a couple more questions. I don't know if you have it. Do you have
Okay, sure.
time, Jim? Sorry, I missed that. Pete, we will have a recording available. I'm gonna email that out to everybody that registered.
But that also will be on our
Which is on YouTube
channel
yes.
as well, right?
Yes. He said, could you explain floating versus emerging marshes, please?
Emergent marshes are where the vegetation goes up above the water. So like cattails, sedges. And submergent is when the vegetation is underneath the water, and then floating is just where it's on top of the water. In fact, the developer kept telling us, we were protesting, they're wanting to develop the marsh. I said, oh, we're not going to touch the marsh. And they were just talking about that little place with cattails. But that was so, it looks like a lot of water between the island and the mainland. But I have seen it at times where I've seen deer walk across there and it hasn't even come up to their knees. And in some early maps, even map it as land because it is so shallow. In fact, when McLeod Steele owned it and they used it for a hunting area for ducks, they would actually put kind of a dam on both sides to the island, and then they would pump water from the river over into it so there'd be enough water to attract ducks.
Excellent. And there was one last question. What can we do to help and advocate for the birds?
Well, one thing, if you live anywhere near Belle Isle or are interested, I certainly would like to see a cadre of folks that would come together and take responsibility for, as under Detroit Audubon's auspices, to recreating a bluebird trail by Blue Heron Pond. And also there are opportunities to get involved with stewardship projects that will advertise. Some of them might be involved with Detroit Bird City. A lot of that's with local residents, but there might be some opportunities there. And also our Black Tern project, we have some opportunities to help build some platform to do some other things with that. But Sarah, you may have other ideas that be in touch with things that I'm not thinking of.
No, I can't think of anything. I mean, I said at the beginning, we love our members. It helps us do all of the things that we do. So that is.
And if we know of stewardship opportunities with others, we'll pass them on as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, again. Thank you, Jim, again. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Yeah. Thanks. Take
Bye.
care.
Thank you. Thanks for a great presentation, Jen. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate that. Pete's one of my colleagues at Wayne County Community College. He's a biology professor.
I'm going to be watching the recording of this for sure.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
I use this in my environmental science classes, by the way.
Oh, yes.
All right. Take care. I'm going to sign off.